Hey there! What you're about to see is a lightly remastered compilation of reviews of the first 6 Star Trek movies. I've gone ahead and edited out all the obligatory begging, so let me go ahead and do it now. Please don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and if you really do like what I'm doing, please consider joining my Patreon to get access to bonus content, vote on future topics, and more. Thank you for watching, and now let's start talking about Star Trek.
All you'll ever be.
Something sinister is approaching the Earth, mercilessly destroying everything in its path. Only one ship and one crew are in any position to confront this giant monstrosity, and it is up to Admiral Kirk and the USS Enterprise, fresh from a years-long redesign, to enter the maw of the unknown to find answers before Voyage swallows up all of mankind. In 1966, NBC debuted a daring science fiction television show called Star Trek. Created by veteran World War II Air Force pilot turned screenwriter Gene Roddenberry, who pitched the show as a wagon train to the stars, Star Trek earned lackluster reviews and consistently lost out to its competition on the other 2 networks in its time slot. It had a dedicated fan base who were able to organize a letter-writing campaign to save it from getting cut from NBC's slate after 2 seasons, but with a 3rd season that suffered from Roddenberry's lack of input and a significantly reduced budget, it couldn't be saved from the studio axe in 1969. A few years later, however, and throughout the early 70s, Star Trek became a massive hit in syndication. Paramount Pictures, who owned the rights to the property, launched Star Trek the Animated Series, which lasted for 2 seasons, and took a few different pitches for a Star Trek movie, an idea that had been floating around since before the show had even been cancelled. Many writers came forward with treatments, including the likes of Ray Bradbury and Harlan Ellison. Gene Roddenberry himself developed a screenplay called The God Thing, which was about an entity from another dimension that comes to Earth claiming to be God before the Enterprise is able to send it back from whence it came. Paramount rejected Roddenberry's pitch at the time over religious objections, but that wasn't the end of the line for The God Thing. Another pitch that was met with far more approval was Star Trek Planet of the Titans, which was to be produced in Britain on a reduced budget by the writing duo of Chris Bryant and Alan Scott. Planet of the Titans had a wild plot that included Captain Kirk being lost on an invisible planet for 3 years as it is slowly pulled into a black hole that ultimately winds up sending the Enterprise crew back to the Paleolithic era. Several directors were sought for the project, including Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Robert Wise, but it was Philip Kaufman who finally agreed to direct. The writers, producers, Roddenberry, and Kaufman all had different visions of the film, and there was a significant amount of tension as a result. There were also problems with William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, each of whom had dropped out at various stages over contract negotiations. One early script had Captain Kirk written out entirely, while others had reduced Spock to little more than a cameo that could be cut if needed. Pre-production began in earnest by the end of 1976, with design work being done by Ken Adam and Ralph McQuarrie, whose version of the Enterprise would eventually go on to inspire the Enterprise D featured in Star Trek The Next Generation. Eventually, however, because of the conflicting visions for the film and a lack of faith in science fiction films in general, the project was cancelled in early 1977. Paramount, now preparing to debut a new television network to compete with the Big Three, pulled a reluctant Roddenberry back to resurrect the original series for a new show called Star Trek Phase 2. The story of Star Trek Phase 2 is a long and fascinating one that we don't have time to get into here, but suffice it to say, after several false starts and millions of dollars being spent on pre-production, Paramount eventually decided to ditch Star Trek Phase 2 in November of 1977, less than 3 weeks before cameras were scheduled to roll. This is not to say the work done on the series was all for naught, as many of its ideas and developed concepts would make their way into Star Trek throughout the years, especially informing Star Trek The Next Generation. What is relevant for today's subject, however, are the creation of the character of Lieutenant Ilea, a Deltan woman to be played by Persis Khambatta, an Indian beauty queen turned actress, and the development of an episode called In Thy Image, which was to be Phase 2's 2-hour pilot. In Thy Image, which was written by British sci-fi author Alan Dean Foster, was loosely based on Roddenberry's earlier film script for The God Thing, mixed with another of Roddenberry's ideas called Robot's Return, and its story involved a giant unknown object called Voyage menacing the Earth in search of its creator. The studio was still uncomfortable with some of the underlying religious and philosophical ideas of the story, so the science fiction grandmaster Isaac Asimov was brought in to offer some polish and reassure dubious producers that the idea of a sentient machine is perfectly in line with scientific reality and does not conflict with the theological mainstream. Thanks in no small part to Asimov's contributions, Foster's treatment for In Thy Image was eventually greenlit and then turned into a teleplay by writer Harold Livingston. After Phase 2 was cancelled, and after the subsequent groundbreaking success of Star Wars, the decision was made to once again develop Star Trek into a feature film. The president and CEO of Paramount at the time, Michael Eisner, was so enamored with the script for In Thy Image that he insisted it be the basis for the new movie. And with the enthusiastic help of executive producer Jeffrey Katzenberg, development finally began on Star Trek: The Motion Picture. After Close Encounters of the Third Kind proved that the box office success of Star Wars wasn't just a fluke, practically every studio in Hollywood began developing sci-fi projects, so pre-production on Star Trek: The Motion Picture was fast-tracked. The script for In Thy Image was given back to Livingston to rework it as a film and to write in the character of Spock, as Leonard Nimoy had declined to be a part of Phase 2, but was now willing to participate in the motion picture. On March 28, 1978, Paramount held an enormous press conference to announce the project, to announce the return of the entire cast, and to announce the hiring of legendary director Robert Wise, famous for such classics as The Day the Earth Stood Still, Run Silent, Run Deep, and The Haunting. Wise was only passingly familiar with Star Trek at the time, but he liked the script and was given a crash course in Star Trek lore by Paramount, who loaned him about a dozen of what they considered to be the most important episodes of the original series. Alongside the entire main cast from the television show, which included Roddenberry's wife Majel Barrett as Christine Chappell and Grace Lee Whitney as Janice Rand, Persis Khambatta agreed to stay on as Lieutenant Ilia, the role that had originally been conceived of as a new regular for Phase 2. There are a few notable cameos in the film as well. David Gautreau, who had been hired to be the Vulcan science officer Zahn as a replacement for Spock in Phase 2, plays the minor role of Commander Branch, and Mark Lenard, best known for playing Spock's father Sarek, plays the doomed Klingon commander in the movie's opening sequence. Finally, Chief DeFalco, the navigator who replaces Ilia on the bridge halfway through the movie, is played by Marcy Lafferty, who was William Shatner's wife at the time. As almost the entire cast had already been signed by the time Robert Wise was brought on board, he was only involved in the hiring of Stephen Collins as Commander Decker, the captain of the Enterprise who was given a field demotion by Admiral Kirk to become the executive officer. Collins was a relatively unknown actor who'd done mostly television work, but nowadays he's known for his 11-year stint as Reverend Eric Camden in Seventh Heaven. While we're on the subject of the cast, Wise was adamant that there be a briefing scene in which most of the crew of the Enterprise is assembled in one place. The crew is largely made up of Star Trek fans, including Betty Trimble, the woman who, with her husband John, organized the letter-writing campaign that convinced NBC to give Star Trek a third season. Also present were various cast and crew associates, including Millicent Wise, the director's second wife. For the music, Gene Roddenberry sought Jerry Goldsmith, his first choice to do the music for the original series. Goldsmith had declined back in 1966 due to other commitments, but he was now eager to answer Roddenberry's call for Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Goldsmith was inspired by George Lucas's approach to Star Wars. Lucas had instructed his composer, John Williams, to give the space opera a grandiose, romantic feeling. Before that, science fiction scores were usually avant-garde and experimental, an approach Goldsmith himself was very familiar with after his work on Planet of the Apes and Logan's Run. Goldsmith decided to forego most of his usual experimentalism and to resist the urge to use Alexander Courage's theme for the original series, but he did struggle for quite a long time to come up with a theme of his own. When he finally did, after several failed attempts, it became one of Star Trek's most well-known musical cues, later serving as the main theme of Star Trek: The Next Generation. It is arguably more well-known today than even Courage's original. Despite a more flowery musical score, Goldsmith did sprinkle in a few experimental instruments and ideas. Most notably, he used a conceptual electronic instrument called a blaster beam to produce the iconic one-note Voyage theme. Goldsmith loved working on Star Trek: The Motion Picture. As it was an effects-heavy spectacle built around long, sweeping shots without much dialogue, Goldsmith was given far more freedom and time than movie composers usually enjoy to develop organic musical transitions and thematic elaborations he would otherwise have to abandon. After Star Trek the Motion Picture, Goldsmith would return to the franchise to do 4 more Star Trek films and to compose the title theme for Star Trek Voyager. Principal photography on Star Trek the Motion Picture began less than 6 months after it was officially announced, even though the script wouldn't be finished for another 4 months after that, and most of the effects hadn't even been decided upon. For Wise and the crew, it was a breakneck, stressful, hectic shoot that was barely holding on through the Herculean efforts of Katzenberg to rally everyone together, but from the point of view of the cast, it seemed relatively easygoing. The shoot wrapped in January of 1979, though there was still an enormous amount of post-production and effects work to be done. Paramount had already committed to a December release date and couldn't budge, so Wise was forced to split the effects work between 2 firms, John Dykstra's Apogee Inc. and Douglas Trumbull's special effects house. Ironically, both Dykstra and Trumbull had been approached very early in pre-production but had turned down the project, only to agree later on when the time crunch became more harrowing. Dykstra was still relatively new to the industry at the time, though he had worked under Trumbull on Silent Running and had been a special effects supervisor on Star Wars, which is where he'd made a name for himself. Trumbull, on the other hand, was already a huge name, having worked on Stanley Kubrick's 2001, Robert Wise's The Andromeda Strain, his own Silent Running, and most recently Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Though Dykstra was ostensibly responsible for the photographic visual effects while Trumbull was in charge of the special effects, the work the 2 teams did was pretty evenly split, making it virtually impossible to tease out which effects to attribute to which group. Still, with such an accelerated timeline and a limited budget, neither team was completely happy with the final product, and many important sequences were never even started, much less finished. Critically, several shots near the climax that would show the enormous Voyager craft in its entirety as it attacks the Earth were reduced to a handful of computer displays and reaction shots, and in the theatrical cut of the film, there are no shots of the entire Voyager craft, even though it was lovingly designed by famed futurist Sid Mead. The editing was no less contentious. Along with a strict release date, Paramount had also mandated a maximum runtime for the final cut of the film, ensuring that it would be able to be shown a certain number of times in each theater upon release. The preliminary cut was much longer than this, though, and so Wise and his editor Tom Ramsey had to decide what to cut and what to keep. They ultimately decided on a philosophy of keeping as much of the effects and spectacle as possible, even if it was at the expense of important character moments. This had the paradoxical effect of making the final cut of the film feel longer than the preliminary one, but there wasn't enough time to get things to where Wise and Ramsey would have liked. There wasn't even enough time to do a preview screening that could have caught this problem, and so almost no one had seen the final cut before it was shipped out, often still drying in the film cans, to theaters. The schedule was so tight, in fact, that Wise had his final cut as a carry-on on his airplane flight to the premiere, which happened on December 7th, 1979. The film made a worldwide box office gross of $139 million, which adjusted for inflation is actually the franchise's highest. Despite this, critics were unimpressed, dismissing the film as ploddingly slow and weak on thrills, noting its lack of a compelling antagonist and dismissing Voyager as nothing more than an evil space cloud. Paramount too considered Star Trek the Motion Picture to be more failure than success, and it's entirely possible that the film was a net loss for the studio. Figuring the actual cost of Star Trek the Motion Picture is tricky, as it was built on the wreckage of multiple previous film projects and the aborted Phase 2. Estimates vary wildly, but the general consensus is that the published budget of $46 million, itself a record high for any Hollywood production at the time, is probably a lowball figure. It also doesn't include the extensive and expensive marketing campaign. However, fans were vocal in their support of the film, and the studio saw enough potential in it to continue the franchise, albeit in a heavily course-corrected direction with Nicholas Meyer and Harve Bennett taking the reins from Gene Roddenberry. Around the turn of the century, Wise approached Paramount with the idea of creating a director's cut of Star Trek the Motion Picture, in which he could reinsert many lost character scenes, recreate some of the lackluster effect shots with modern CGI, and put in the shots that were never made, including the critical Voyager sequences from the climax. The CG work was built to look like it could have been done in 1979, with the effects team even matching the film grain and age to make it as seamlessly integrated as possible. The final result, Star Trek the Motion Picture The Director's Cut, is a far superior experience than the theatrical version, and it proves that if Paramount had given Wise and his team more time, the film might have been more successful. Still, Star Trek the Motion Picture, Director's Cut or otherwise, has a tainted reputation, often dismissed as inferior to most of the subsequent sequels, though still superior to Star Trek V, which nobody wants to talk about.
I need my pain!
This, I think, is unfair. Yes, the film, especially the theatrical version, is a slow affair that gets a bit carried away with a 2001-style spectacle, and yes, it was a big tonal shift away from the original series' lighthearted humor. Indeed, with the exception of the cast remaining the same, it is as different to the Star Trek television show that preceded it as the 2009 soft reboot of Star Trek is to it. However, thematically at least, this was a big leap forward for the franchise, an important stepping stone. In the director's cut, where the characters are given enough time to develop properly, it is clear what the writers were trying to convey, that this is a movie about finding meaning in both grounded personal ways and in heady philosophical ones. It is trying to show us that the answers we seek are rarely what we expect, that meaning comes to us when we let go of our preconceptions and arrogance. Just as Voyager is forced to reevaluate the worth of biological life when it learns its creators were human, Spock learns that pure logic is unfulfilling without human emotion, Decker learns that the ambitions of command are a poor substitute for love, and Kirk learns to find happiness in being true to himself. If Star Trek the Motion Picture had truly failed, the franchise would have died with it, and the fact that we're over 50 years into the franchise's existence with no sign of it going anywhere is proof enough that Star Trek the Motion Picture did its job. It laid the groundwork for a franchise that was clawing its way out of cancellation and into true cultural significance, and science fiction would be far lesser today without it.
What was the problem down there?
He insisted we go first, sir. Said something about first seeing how it scrambled our molecules.
Lost in the depths of space, the genetically modified terrorist Khan, along with his crew of outcasts, is discovered by the crew of the USS Reliant, who are looking for a test planet for a new scientific miracle called the Genesis device. Khan hijacks the vessel with plans to steal Genesis for use as a superweapon and take revenge upon the universe, more specifically the man he blames for his wife's death, Admiral James T. Kirk. After what the company felt was a failure in Star Trek the Motion Picture, Paramount Pictures, specifically Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, decided to give Star Trek one more chance on the silver screen. Gene Roddenberry had already written a sequel, which involved the Enterprise crew leaping through time via the Guardian of Forever to prevent the Klingons from interfering with the Kennedy assassination, but Paramount, blaming Roddenberry for many of the first film's problems, rejected it outright. They made the decision to instead hand the project over to their television division, cutting out Roddenberry almost entirely, but the movie was still planned to be released as a feature film in theaters. As a lead producer, they hired Harve Bennett, a recent acquisition known for developing television series such as The Mod Squad, The $6 Million Man, and The Bionic Woman. Bennett promised that he could produce a movie for a fraction of what the first one cost, telling the studio heads he could actually make 5 movies for that much money, and he brought on his friend Robert Sallin to serve as producer. Unfortunately, Bennett was completely unfamiliar with Star Trek, and so he procured copies from Paramount of every episode of the television series, which he screened over the course of 3 months to familiarize himself with the story and universe. He also consulted with noted Star Trek superfans Betty and John Trimble. Eisner and Katzenberg were keen on making a direct sequel to Star Trek the Motion Picture, but Bennett felt that the story of that film had been too slow and too far removed from the series, so he decided to make a direct sequel to one of Star Trek's television episodes, though it would of course follow the continuity of the previous film. Looking specifically for an antagonist, something he felt the first film lacked, Bennett found himself drawn to Khan Noonien Singh, the genetically superpowered villain of the first season's Space Seed. Bennett felt that Khan was the perfect foil for Kirk, that he was the only villain in the entire show to really threaten Kirk to the core, and couldn't ignore the fact that the episode ends on a tantalizing tease, with Khan and his crew exiled on an alien world left to their own devices. At this point, a few different scripts were produced. Bennett himself wrote one called The War of the Generations, which involved Khan, Kirk, and Kirk's newly discovered son all wrapped up in a rebellion on a distant planet. Jack Sowards, a staple television writer,
wrote one called The Omega Syndrome, which involved the theft of a Federation superweapon.
What does the Omega-13 device do?
Many happen to believe that it is a matter collapser, bomb capable of destroying pretty much everything in about 13 seconds.
And Samuel A. Peoples, the writer of the original series' second pilot episode Where No Man Has Gone Before, wrote a script that involved 2 Enterprise crew members gaining godlike powers and threatening the Earth, which was immediately rejected as being way too similar to his original Star Trek episode. Sowards would ultimately get final writing credit on the film, but the creation of the script for Star Trek II was much more of a collaborative effort, with Bennett penning most of the early drafts himself. When someone suggested turning the Omega weapon into a peaceful terraforming device, Bennett incorporated that into a new script called the Genesis Project.
What exactly is Genesis? Well, put simply, Genesis is life from lifelessness.
One significant hurdle at this preliminary stage was Leonard Nimoy, who had been lukewarm about returning for the first Star Trek film and was again hesitant to come on board for another one, especially after reading Bennett's script, which both Nimoy and Bennett agreed was lackluster. Nimoy was firmly in the hate column of his lifelong love-hate relationship with the character of Spock, but Bennett managed to get him to agree to don the ears one more time by promising him a great death scene. Bennett saw this as a win-win for Nimoy. If this really was to be the final Star Trek film, as many people thought it would be at the time, then Nimoy's character would go out with a memorable bang. But if the movie was successful enough to warrant future sequels, he wouldn't have to be a part of them.
Just logical.
With Paramount eager to get the ball rolling, Bennett began looking for a director who could reconcile the various troubled scripts. His first choice was Ron Howard, but when that fell through, he turned to the relative newcomer Nicholas Meyer, writer of the Sherlock Holmes novel The 7% Solution, who'd made his directorial debut with the well-received Time After Time. Meyer was completely unfamiliar with Star Trek, or much television at all for that matter, but he was given a crash course by Bennett, who'd only just recently gotten saturated himself. After watching a handful of Star Trek episodes and reading all of the working scripts, Meyer sat down with the creative team and decided to hammer out one coherent story. He made lists of what worked and what didn't work from each potential script, be they plot elements, thematic ideas, new characters, individual scenes, or even just good lines of dialogue.
Logic clearly dictates that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Or the one.
And then he tried to find a way to thread them all together. With the death of Spock, the idea of the Genesis device, and Khan tearing out of the past with homicide in his eyes, Meyer figured this was a story about life and death, so he built everything around the skeleton of Kirk facing middle age. Meyer made a few key decisions that upset Roddenberry. For one thing, Meyer wanted to more clearly lay out the military structure of Starfleet, making it akin to the Navy. Roddenberry preferred to think of it more like the Coast Guard and was vehemently against portraying Starfleet in a more militaristic light. Meyer wanted to give an actual date, albeit the vague 23rd century, but Roddenberry had always insisted the date be kept unknown. Meyer also wanted to bring the characters a bit more down to earth, have them do things like read books, need glasses, vacuum the halls, make sarcastic quips, and be skeptical of Starfleet, which Roddenberry opposed on philosophical grounds. Roddenberry believed that humanity would evolve beyond itself, whereas Meyer felt that people, in general, don't change very much, no matter how much technology might advance. While I'm more inclined to agree with the more optimistic Roddenberry on this point, I think Meyer's point of view makes for better, more relatable storytelling. Meyer is also often credited with injecting humor back into Star Trek after the more antiseptic first film, but most of the funny lines and down-to-earth interactions come from Bennett's earlier scripts. Regardless, Meyer is responsible for making Star Trek feel more
human.
With Roddenberry constantly finding his demands overruled or ignored, he became bitter about the whole thing. When he learned that they were planning to kill Spock, he got even more upset. According to pretty reliable sources, Roddenberry then leaked the planned death, which all involved were desperate to keep a secret. Fans were then upset, with some even penning death threats to everyone involved in the film, saying things like, "If Spock dies, you die." To counter this, Meyer decided to open the film on the now famous Kobayashi Maru simulator scene, in which Spock dies, but not really. He felt this would be enough of a misdirect to help audiences forget the whole thing and be surprised when Spock really does die in the film's final moments. Another problem Meyer faced was that the studio had once again booked a release date in advance, and in order to give the special effects teams at ILM, supervised by Ken Ralston and Jim Valou, enough time to get everything done on schedule, he had a mere 12 days to finish the script. Eschewing payment or credit, Meyer went ahead and did a page 1 rewrite himself in just 10 days. After completing his new script, now titled Star Trek II: The Undiscovered Country, Meyer faced a new problem. William Shatner didn't like it. Notoriously protective of James Kirk as a character, Shatner was skeptical about showing his age, and he felt that Kirk had been pushed too far into the background of the story. Meyer made a few overnight tweaks to the script to push Kirk more into the forefront, and Shatner was reportedly pleased, especially after Harve Bennett convinced him that he could use the role to age gracefully. One concession that had to be made, though, was that Kirk's age is never given an actual number in the film, even though in Meyer's script he is said to be turning 49. Paramount would later retitle the film against Meyer's wishes to The Vengeance of Khan, but that title felt a little too close to the then working title of the third Star Wars film, Revenge of the Jedi, so Paramount settled on The Wrath of Khan. Of course, Meyer would get the chance to reuse his original title, The Undiscovered Country, when he returned to direct the 6th film in the franchise. With time running out, somebody finally bothered to ask Ricardo Montalban, the actor who played Khan in Space Seed, if he could do the film. Montalban was in the midst of filming Fantasy Island, and scheduling time to work on a film was nearly impossible. Still, Montalban liked the idea and agreed to do it for less than he was eventually paid, which wound up being $100,000. The only snag was that he could only be brought in for about 10 days of work. Montalban's scenes were then shot without most of the rest of the cast even present. Montalban and Shatner, for instance, never saw each other during production, with Montalban forced to deliver all of Khan's venomous lines directed at Kirk to a script girl off-screen. Though this scheduling difficulty often takes the blame for why Kirk and Khan never have a direct confrontation in the film, the fact is that Meyer's script never had them in the same room at the same time, not once, even though Shatner wanted it and some of the pre-Meyer scripts did have the two men come to blows. One of the scripts even gave them a sword fight.
I'll chase him round the moons of Nibia and round the Antares maelstrom and round perdition's flames before I give him up.
For the new character of Lieutenant Savick, Meyer initially wanted to cast Kim Cattrall, but she was unavailable. He then hired the virtually unknown Kirstie Alley, still 5 years away from starring in Cheers. Alley was a Star Trek fan from childhood, and she did a reportedly pitch-perfect Spock impression during her audition. Not everybody was comfortable with the casting, however, with the most vocal disapproval coming from, who else, Gene Roddenberry, who didn't think she was alien enough. Savick had been around as a character in the early pre-Meyer scripts as a male character, probably another Spock replacement, which explains why her name starts with an S instead of a T in violation of previously established Vulcan naming conventions. She was intended to be a half-Vulcan, half-Romulan hybrid, but the dialogue that explained that wound up either on the cutting room floor or never even being filmed. This is why, in the movie, Savick appears more emotional than a full-blooded Vulcan, even shedding tears during Spock's funeral. There were plans to include the character of Lieutenant Marla McGivers, who was exiled with Khan and became his wife. However, the actress who played her in Space Seed, Madeline Rue, had been confined to a wheelchair as a result of multiple sclerosis. She still acted, despite the wheelchair, but the writers decided it would work better for Khan's motivation if her character was dead prior to the Reliance arrival at Ceti Alpha. Unfortunately for Rue, that was probably the right choice. And while other, smaller Enterprise staples like Module Barrett and Grace Lee Whitney didn't return, the recurring background character of Lieutenant Kyle, played by John Winston, was promoted to commander and put aboard the Reliant. Filming began in November of 1981, with ILM already hard at work on the effects. To save money, the crew scavenged, borrowed, and rented props wherever they could, such as reusing the space station from the first film by flipping it upside down and calling it Regula 1. And when they built their own props and models, they often used literal trash, such as packing materials, which they molded into set dressings and other useful materials. The costumes were redesigned to fit Meyer's vision too, with the costume designer swapping out the sterile white uniforms with more earthy, deep red ones, and inventing new rank insignia, which had never been consistently applied in Star Trek before. Even though the final designs on screen look elaborate, there wasn't enough time or money to add anything as simple as pockets. Other things they planned to redesign, like phasers and communicators, had to be compromised, with the old props from the previous movie brought in instead. The new ship, the Reliant, worried producers because they were concerned audiences wouldn't be able to tell the two Starfleet ships apart during the battles, which were storyboarded like old battleships swapping broadsides. By a happy accident, though, when Bennett was sent an early sketch of the Reliant, he unwittingly pulled it out of the envelope upside down and approved it by signing his name on the bottom. When the effects people got the sketch back with Bennett's upside-down signature at the top, they went with it, which is why the Reliant's warp nacelles are beneath the saucer instead of above it. The movie was filmed entirely on sound stages, with approximately 65% of it performed on a single set that had modular pieces that could be rearranged to form the Simulator Bridge, the Enterprise Bridge, and the Reliant Bridge. The biggest set was the desert of Ceti Alpha 5, which had sand blown around by high-powered fans and made for an unpleasant shooting environment. For a few scenes, they used clever matte-like cutouts placed directly in front of the camera to simulate sets that didn't actually exist. But the one heavily matted sequence that Meyer was particularly unhappy with was the Genesis Cave. Alas, there wasn't enough time or money to improve it. For the Genesis Project's proposal video, which is the first full-screen, fully 3D CG sequence to be used in a major motion picture, they hired a small division of Lucasfilm called the Graphics Group, which would later splinter off from Lucasfilm to become a little independent company called Pixar. Meyer proved to be particularly adept at working with his actors, and he took unique approaches to each one. Worried that Montalban and Shatner might overdo their performances, he found ways to make them tone it down to a more appropriate level. For Montalban, he simply convinced the actor that Khan was more menacing when he kept his volume down. Montalban loved this direction and required very few takes to get his performance right, which was good since he only had 10 days to work. Shatner proved to be a little more challenging though, but Meyer discovered he could get the best performance from him by forcing him to do take after take after take until the actor became tired and bored, which kept him from overacting. That said, pitting two of the most theatrical, bombastic actors against each other is kind of genius in and of itself, and Montalban remains the single best foil ever for Shatner. Their interplay is so wonderful, you never even notice they don't share the screen. Overall, the cast found the shoot far more fun and entertaining than the previous one. Actors who had been wary of doing the film, like George Takei, found the experience so rewarding that they would never reconsider being a part of Star Trek again. Even Leonard Nimoy noticed the atmosphere, and when the dailies started coming in and they could see how well the movie was coming together, he began to reconsider his character's death. Bennett and Nimoy conspired to include the brief mind meld shot right before Spock's sacrifice, which he felt was enough to ensure his potential return should the movie be successful. Early preview screenings ended with Spock's funeral, but the audience reaction was troubling, with people walking out of the theater in quiet disbelief. Meyer wasn't particularly worried about it, but both Bennett and the studio wanted the movie to end on a more hopeful note, so they came up with the idea of showing Spock's torpedo on the Genesis planet. Meyer fought vehemently against this, even refusing to film that sequence, but in the end, he was overruled. When the more hopeful ending was shown to test audiences, the reaction was vastly improved, with applause replacing silence.
He's really not dead. As long as we remember it.
To score the film on a reduced budget, Paramount brought in James Horner, a newcomer to the scene who had worked on a few B-movies such as Battle Beyond the Stars and The Lady in Red. Star Trek II was his biggest movie to date, and he'd coincidentally been present during much of Jerry Goldsmith's work on the original film. Outside of that experience, Horner, like Bennett and Meyer, was largely unfamiliar with Star Trek. The studio gave him strict orders not to use any of Goldsmith's previous themes, and Meyer wanted something that evoked swashbuckling Navy adventures like Horatio Hornblower and submarine thrillers like The Enemy Below, which had coincidentally been inspirations for the original series. With these directives, Horner, who makes a cameo in the film, created a hybrid of the orchestral Goldsmith score and the exciting music from the show. He even threw in the series' original theme music by Alexander Courage, which was conspicuously absent from the previous film. As much as I love Goldsmith's work on Star Trek the Motion Picture, Horner's themes might just be my favorite pieces of music from any Star Trek movie. Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan opened on June 4th, 1982, and it made a record-breaking $14.5 million on its opening weekend. In its initial run, it made a domestic box office gross of $79 million. And though that was less than Star Trek the Motion Picture had made, it was enough for Paramount to consider it a resounding success. Critics were much warmer on the film as well, immediately crediting it with reviving a franchise that had been all but killed by the first film. Its pacing, writing, and sheer entertainment value were all considered major highlights, and both William Shatner and Nicholas Meyer earned Saturn Awards for their work. In the long run, The Wrath of Khan left an indelible mark on both science fiction cinema and on Star Trek. Despite annoying Gene Roddenberry with its more down-to-earth approach to the universe and its characters, Meyer's portrayal of Starfleet has greatly informed every subsequent film and television series in the franchise. Whether it's the broad strokes like the more Navy-like organization, or the more subtle innovations like giving the interior of every spaceship a constant background hum, Meyer's influences are still felt in Star Trek today. Ask Trek fans young and old, be they Trekkies or Trekkers, and they'll most likely tell you Star Trek II is one of the best, if not the best, film in the entire Star Trek canon. J.J. Abrams did try to remake it in a roundabout sort of way with 2013's Star Trek Into Darkness, and though I think that movie gets more flack than it deserves, it doesn't hold a candle to Meyer's original film. Similarly, though I continually defend Star Trek the Motion Picture, I know in my heart that Star Trek wouldn't have survived had The Wrath of Khan not been the amazing movie that it is. In truth, it probably is Star Trek at its best.
Would you like a tranquilizer?
I had 1/4 impulse power.
Admiral Kirk and the crew of the Enterprise is mourning the death of Captain Spock. As they return to Earth, this feeling is made all the worse when Dr. McCoy seems to have a mental break and when they learn that the Enterprise is set to be decommissioned. Meanwhile, a brutal Klingon commander is on his way to the Genesis planet to steal its secrets from the Federation science team that is studying it. On the surface is Kirk's son, David Marcus, who along with Lieutenant Savick has just found a young boy who appears to possess the resurrected body of Captain Spock. When Kirk learns that Spock's spirit might still be alive in the troubled Dr. McCoy, he and the Enterprise crew must risk everything to take back their ship and go on one last mission to save their lost friend.
The day after Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan hit theaters, Paramount greenlit a third entry in the franchise, with Harve Bennett still on board to not only produce the film, but also write the script. Nicholas Meyer, who had written and directed the previous film, chose not to return, as he was still upset over the changes made against his will to the ending of Star Trek II. It was pretty obvious, given that ending, that this new film should focus on the resurrection of Spock in one form or another, and so the first order of business was getting Leonard Nimoy to sign on. Exactly how that came about is a murky subject with a lot of rumors and speculations surrounding it, but the generally accepted story is that Bennett asked Nimoy what it would take to get him to come back as Spock, and Nimoy said he wanted to direct. Bennett and the studio were considering hiring James Goldstone, the director of the original series' second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, but after some vacillation over the specifics of Nimoy's contract from Paramount head Michael Eisner, Nimoy eventually landed in the director's chair. With Nimoy attached and the rest of the original series cast enthusiastic about coming back for another film, Bennett began writing the script backwards, starting with what he knew should be the ending, Spock recognizing Kirk and calling him Jim, and then figuring out how to get there from where things left off at the end of the previous story. He and Meyer had developed an idea during the writing of Star Trek II that was called Return to Genesis, in which the Enterprise, without Spock, tries to save Saavik and David from hostile aliens trying to capture the secrets of the Genesis planet, and Bennett built off of that as well. Early drafts included the Romulans as the main villains, but both Nimoy and Bennett ultimately agreed that the Klingons were more appropriate for the story they wanted to tell, and the studio also felt that the Klingons would be a better draw. The Romulan influence persisted through most of the early drafts though, and almost all the way into production, the bird of prey that faces off against the Enterprise was envisioned as a Romulan vessel that had been hijacked by the Klingons. To play the Klingon commander Kruge, Nimoy fought to get Christopher Lloyd. Paramount was hesitant, not thinking of Lloyd as anything but the comedic television actor from Taxi.
When are they gonna clean those bathrooms? You were in the kitchen. Thank goodness.
But Nimoy was adamant, knowing how easy it would be for Lloyd to become typecast if nobody went to bat for him.
Then I hope pain is something you enjoy.
Similarly, for the arrogant captain of the Excelsior, Nimoy and Bennett hired James Sikking, known primarily for his role in Hill Street Blues at the time, though he'd recently been in feature films such as Ordinary People and Outland. Merritt Buttrick reprised his role as David from the previous film, but Kirstie Alley, who played Saavik, did not return. There are two commonly cited reasons why. The first is that she didn't want to be typecast as a Vulcan the way Nimoy had been, and the second is that, since her contract for Wrath of Khan didn't include anything about sequels, she was able to demand more money than Paramount was willing to give. Whatever the reason though, the role of Saavik had to be recast, and it went to the almost completely unknown Robin Curtis. In Star Trek II, Saavik had been written as a half-Romulan, but for Star Trek III, she was conceived of from the ground up as a full-blooded Vulcan, so her performance is distinct enough from Alley's to be able to think of her as an almost entirely different character. Other notable actors include Dame Judith Anderson as the Vulcan High Priestess, John Larroquette as Maltz, the only Klingon to actually survive the film, Mark Lenard reprising his role as Spock's father Sarek, Grace Lee Whitney in a brief cameo as Janice Rand, the film's cinematographer, Charles Correll, as a briefly seen janitor, and Miguel Ferrer in one of his first on-screen appearances. Paramount initially agreed to a budget range of $10 to $13 million, though they later increased it to $16 million. While this was a marginal increase over Star Trek II's budget, it was still pretty small for a major science fiction film at the time. Paramount, however, had faith in Bennett's proven economy and adaptability. A lot of sets, costumes, and props were retained from earlier films too, and though there were a few more sets built for Star Trek III and some of the props were redesigned, most of the increased budget went to special effects. Those were handled once again by Industrial Light and Magic, under the supervision of Ken Ralston. With the increased time and money afforded to the company, ILM was able to design a new space station, a few new starships that would become iconic mainstays of the franchise for decades, and of course, blow up the Enterprise in spectacular fashion. Star Trek III set a new standard for spectacle in the series that wouldn't be matched again until a few movies later. Principal photography began in August of 1983 under tight security. With the exception of a single day of location shooting at Occidental College, the entire film was done on sound stages on the Paramount lot. The stage that served as the Genesis planet, Soundstage 15, nearly burned down in an arson fire that took out several of Paramount's stages, but the fire was put out, with the help of some of the cast and crew, including William Shatner, before too much damage was done. There was one significant plot leak during filming, namely the fact that the Enterprise itself was going to be destroyed. This garnered some controversy, though it wasn't treated as seriously by the fandom as Spock's death had been when Star Trek II was in the works. Bennett and Nimoy were relieved that the fan magazines were mostly dismissive of the leak as a rumor when they bothered to mention it at all, but the filmmakers were then horrified when, shortly before the film's release, Paramount went ahead and spoiled it anyway in the movie's trailer.
Join us on this, the final voyage of the Starship Enterprise. Star Trek III, The Search for Spock.
Despite this, despite a surprisingly weak marketing campaign in general, and despite the fact that it was competing with the likes of Indiana Jones and Ghostbusters, the film earned back its entire operating budget on its opening weekend in June of 1984. In its initial run, it made a total domestic gross of $76.5 million, more than enough to justify the green light for Star Trek IV. Critics were mostly happy with it too, praising its operatic style, special effects, and overall design aesthetic, though they didn't rate it quite as highly as they had its predecessor. As for my personal opinion of Star Trek III, I have to admit to being pretty torn on it. On one hand, it is a brisk and exciting adventure that feels more like the original Star Trek television show than its cinematic predecessors. I enjoy its unabashed sense of fun, and Christopher Lloyd's Commander Kruge is a memorable villain, maybe not as cunning and intelligent as Khan, but somehow even more ruthless. He's certainly the best and most memorable Klingon up to this point in the canon. And I also don't mind the inversion of Spock's logic from Star Trek II, the idea that, for humans, sometimes the needs of the one can be more important than the needs of the many, despite all logic. I especially like Kirk's line near the end about how, even though he sacrificed a lot to bring Spock back, he would have lost part of his soul if he hadn't tried. On the other hand, the writer in me finds the story absolutely infuriating in how it undoes pretty much everything that was built in The Wrath of Khan. I don't know if this was Bennett's television instincts kicking in, but the direction of the plot seems to be heading backward to the status quo rather than forward into Brave New Worlds. Bringing Spock back is one thing that is perfectly forgivable, especially given how much the ending of Star Trek II sets it up, but the movie goes out of its way to try to put the Genesis genie back in the bottle, to kill off Kirk's son, and to downplay the embrace of middle age that was so important for these characters. It even lays the groundwork for Kirk's eventual demotion back to captain, in addition to layering on William Shatner's makeup so thick you'd think he was trying to paint away 20 years. The only character with a satisfying arc is Bones, who comes to realize just how close he was to Spock and how much he relied on that connection. When combined with DeForest Kelley's performance, Bones is probably the best thing about the movie. But even his emotional journey feels a little underdeveloped, relegated to only one or two poignant scenes. That said, the movie does have some thematic depth, and it's bold enough to destroy the Enterprise for the first and probably most emotionally impactful time in all of Star Trek. It develops both the Klingons and the Vulcans in ways that would greatly inform their portrayals in future films and television series, and the comedic moments are endearing without taking away from the story's more serious emotional beats. No, it's not the masterpiece that Star Trek II is, and yes, I do have some problems with it, but it's still a better movie than is suggested by its general reputation with Trekkies and Trekkers, who tend to lump it in with the other, less popular odd-numbered films in the franchise.
I need my pain!
The Search for Spock is often looked back on as the middle chapter in a trilogy within the Star Trek film series, and as such, it does its job pretty well. It manages to continue the successes of its predecessor and lay the groundwork for its sequel, ensuring that Star Trek would be an enduring franchise for years to come. It wasn't long after Star Trek III that plans started getting drawn up for Star Trek's eventual return to television with The Next Generation, and so maybe the film deserves credit for proving that Star Trek II wasn't a fluke, that the franchise was just as influential and popular as ever. It's also worth noting that it set a new trend for Trek behind the scenes. When Nimoy came on to direct, some of the original cast members were a bit wary of the idea of one of their own taking charge, but after some initial awkwardness and hesitation, they did come to learn that they were actually pretty happy with the arrangement. Nimoy had already secured the job for the next film, and it became extremely common from Star Trek III onward for various cast members to direct not only the Star Trek films, but also episodes of the television series that followed. Far from being just a throwaway anecdote in Star Trek's story then, Star Trek III: The Search for Spock is an essential turning point, the first movie in the franchise to be made with high hopes for its future. If that doesn't make it quintessentially Star Trek, I don't know what else it could be.
Help us or die.
I do not deserve to live.
Fine, I'll kill you later.
A mysterious alien probe is approaching Earth. Its motives are unknown, and it renders helpless anyone in its way. As the Earth is racked with devastating storms and the probe saps all of mankind's energy reserves, it is up to the renegade Admiral Kirk and his crew in the stolen Klingon bird of prey to figure out what the probe wants. Unfortunately, they quickly discover that the only thing that can stop it is the humpback lost to whaling ships centuries earlier, and the only way they can find one is to go back in time to late 20th century Earth.
After the success of Star Trek III: The Search for Spock, Paramount quickly greenlit Star Trek IV with the intention of releasing it in 1986, to take advantage of the 20th anniversary of the franchise. Harve Bennett was kept on as lead producer, and Leonard Nimoy was hired to direct after William Shatner, who shared a Most Favored Nations clause with Leonard Nimoy in their respective contracts, declined due to obligations with his television show T.J. Hooker. Shatner was initially reluctant to sign on at all, and for a brief while, Bennett and Nimoy considered producing a prequel set in Starfleet Academy, with young actors replacing the main cast. However, Paramount eventually came to an agreement with Shatner for an increase in pay and an assurance that he would be able to direct any potential Star Trek V, so Bennett and Nimoy scrapped the prequel idea and started coming up with plans for a continuation of the plot of Star Trek III. Bennett's first concept was a courtroom drama in which Admiral Kirk and crew are put on trial for their actions, with an added subplot involving assassination intrigue, Klingons, and even the memorable original series character Harry Mudd. This was turned into a screenplay by the writing duo of Steve Mearson and Peter Crix, but Paramount gave it a hard pass. Nimoy was keen on tackling environmental subject matter, and when word came down that the studio wanted to do time travel, Bennett and Nimoy came up with the idea of having the Enterprise crew go back in time to recover something that was lost due to mankind's negligence.
Now wait just a damn
Spock, start your computations for time warp.
Early concepts included needing a plant that had been rendered extinct by the destruction of the rainforests in order to cure a 23rd century disease, but they had a hard time making that work as it didn't present many plot obstacles and seemed a bit too grim for the lighthearted tone Nimoy was interested in. Eventually, Nimoy read up on extinct animal species and became interested in whales. Coincidentally, William Shatner, who was initially opposed to the idea of a time travel yarn, had not only done work with Greenpeace for the Save the Whales movement, but had even done a one-man play that used both whale song and the D.H. Lawrence poem Whales Weep Not, which Kirk quotes in the film.
They say the sea is cold, but the sea contains the hottest blood of all.
Mearson and Crix were again tasked with writing the script, and one mandate they were given was to include a character to be played by Eddie Murphy, whose career was on the rise after Beverly Hills Cop and who was reportedly a huge Star Trek fan. The character they wrote for him was an astrophysicist at Berkeley, but Murphy, who wanted to play an alien, passed on the idea in favor of doing the Golden Child. Bennett and Nimoy were unhappy with the script Mearson and Crix had delivered, feeling that it needed to be, quote, trekked up, unquote. Facing a time crunch, Bennett agreed to rewrite part of the script himself, namely the first and third acts, which are set in the future, and asked Star Trek II's Nicholas Meyer to come in for the rest. Meyer, whose Time After Time was another time travel movie set in San Francisco, wanted to change the setting to Paris, but for various reasons, logistical and narrative, that didn't happen. However, Meyer was able to include a scene similar to one he'd cut from Time After Time, involving a guy with a boombox. The punk music that was originally chosen for this scene wasn't very good, according to associate producer Kirk Thatcher, who also happens to play the punk, so he and a few other crew members got together and whipped up I Hate You to replace it. Thatcher reprises his role, sort of, in a brief cameo in Spider-Man Homecoming. How much of the Mearson and Crix script for Star Trek IV remains in the final film is a subject of some controversy, with Mearson and Crix claiming that quite a bit of their version was retained, but with Bennett and Meyer alleging that virtually none of it was kept in place. Meyer claims to have never even read the Mearson and Crix script, but because of Writers Guild arbitration, Mearson and Crix were given top writing credits, above that of Bennett and Meyer. I tend to buy Mearson and Crix' version of events, but it's hard to deny that the final version of the film feels very much like a Nicholas Meyer story, with its cynical undercurrents, playful tone, and a notable lack of any on-screen violence. One subplot we know came from the Mearson and Crick script and was eventually deleted by Nimoy involves the pregnancy of Lieutenant Saavik with Spock's child, presumably from their Pon farr ritual on the Genesis planet. Nimoy was never particularly comfortable with this subplot, which is why he ultimately removed it from the film, much to the disappointment of the actress who plays Saavik, Robin Curtis. Whatever the case, the final script, as written by Bennett and Meyer, was approved by everyone involved: Paramount, Nimoy, and even William Shatner. The rest of the cast came aboard with little trouble, and the only missing piece was the new character of Dr. Gillian Taylor, an amalgamation of the Eddie Murphy character and a television reporter from earlier scripts. While there is a persistent rumor that she was added at the insistence of William Shatner, who thought Kirk needed a love interest, Nimoy has always insisted that this is not true, that he came up with the character after watching a documentary on whales during the story's development. To play the enthusiastic cetologist, they hired Catherine Hicks, who had done quite a bit of television work, was nominated for an Emmy for playing Marilyn Monroe, and who would star in another time travel film in 1986, Peggy Sue Got Married. She knew next to nothing about Star Trek going into it, and she purposefully remained ignorant throughout production, hoping to pass on her own bewilderment to the character.
You're not exactly catching us at our best.
That much is certain.
Other notable actors include Mark Leonard and Jane Wyatt reprising their roles as Spock's parents, Majel Barrett as Christine Chapel in what was supposed to be a much bigger role, Grace Lee Whitney as Janice Rand, and Brock Peters as Admiral Cartwright, along with blink and you'll miss some cameos from Michael Berryman and the Go-Go's Jane Weedlin. Filming began in February of 1986 on a budget of $22 million, with a significant portion of the film shot on location in and around San Francisco, a rarity for Star Trek. The real-life Monterey Bay Aquarium serves as the fictitious Cetacean Institute, though there is a lot of cinematic trickery to disguise a few duplicate sets and the fact that the Monterey Bay Aquarium doesn't have any tanks even close to large enough to hold humpback whales. The aircraft carrier scenes weren't filmed on the USS Enterprise either, but rather the USS Ranger, notable for the fact that it doesn't have a nuclear reactor. Those scenes were written to take place in Golden Gate Park in the film. These scenes were actually filmed in Will Rogers Park in Los Angeles.
Everybody remember where we parked.
Much of the rest of the film was done on sets, and a water tank built into a parking lot on the Paramount backlots. The Bird of Prey interior was completely redesigned, as the set from Star Trek III had been much too small, not to mention the fact that it had been completely scrapped, and the bridge of the Saratoga was a redress of the original Enterprise set from Star Trek the Motion Picture.
Admiral, there be whales here!
Surprisingly, almost none of the whales seen in the movie are real. Industrial Light and Magic developed several models, including remote control miniatures, a full-size tails section on rails, and a full-sized front end for when Spock does his mind meld.
What the hell?
Leonard Nimoy took great joy in fielding complaints from animal rights groups, reassuring them that no humpback whales were harmed or harassed for the film. The music was put together by Nimoy's friend, Leonard Rosenman, who'd done the music for Fantastic Voyage, 1978's Lord of the Rings, and the first two Planet of the Apes sequels. Rosenman goes for more variety and energy than the previous Trek standard, and though his soundtrack is not my favorite, it's definitely memorable. Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home released on November 26, 1986. It received a surprisingly warm reception from critics, who enjoyed its fun tone and applauded it for its appeal to non-Trekkies, and it earned $133 million in worldwide gross, making it one of the biggest earners of the year. Paramount would consider this the best performing Star Trek film until the J.J. Abrams reboot 2 decades later. Particularly notable was a showing in Moscow, arranged by the World Wildlife Fund. Harve Bennett remembers the screening fondly, recalling how the film got its biggest laugh from the Soviet crowd with the line,
"The bureaucratic mentality is the only constant in the universe."
As for me, I think the movie's fine. The plot is pretty silly and contrived if you stop to think about it, but if you can just roll with the premise, it's definitely an entertaining fish-out-of-water tale. You can tell the cast and crew were having a good time making it, and the underlying conservationist theme is inoffensive and appropriate. Granted, if taken too literally, it's probably the strangest conservationist message I've come across this side of John C. Lilly. we should make sure the whales survive just in case their enigmatic songs are actually interstellar communications with an alien intelligence that will one day come looking for them while unwittingly disabling everything in their path, but Nimoy's heart was definitely in the right place. Though the initial premise, an alien probe is causing havoc as it approaches the Earth, is undeniably similar to that of Star Trek the Motion Picture, this movie does try to do something different from the previous films. It is more confident than Star Trek 3, and it manages to juggle everyone in the cast more effectively. It has a fantastic arc for Spock in particular.
Forgive me, Doctor. I'm receiving a number of distress calls.
I don't doubt it.
And it is nice to see some of the characters who don't usually play off of each other being put into awkward situations together. I appreciate that the movie tries to have a timely socio-political message, and I love that it isn't afraid to play off of its own absurdity. It's a Star Trek flick that doesn't mind poking a little fun at Star Trek, and it's no coincidence that this was the film William Shatner was promoting when he did his Get a Life speech on Saturday Night Live.
Get a life, will you, people? Crying out loud, it's just a TV show.
As with Star Trek 3 though, I find the direction of the narrative pretty frustrating. This movie goes out of its way to point out that there should be consequences to the events of the previous film, but in the end, those consequences amount to resetting the universe to its status quo, with everyone but Admiral Kirk escaping punishment, and Kirk's punishment being that he is now forced to do what he wanted to do all along and be the captain of the Enterprise again. It's farcically neat, and it is the last nail in the coffin of everything Meyer tried to do with these characters in Star Trek II. Granted, Meyer would eventually be able to move them forward again in Star Trek VI, but that's a story for another video.
Hey, why don't you watch where you're going? You!
Out of a neglected wasteland where hope goes to die, walks a being like no other, a Vulcan heretic convinced of the existence of a divine creator and an eternal paradise, common beliefs of all the religions of all the cultures of the known universe. With a flock of dedicated followers, this man, Spock, manages to hijack the starship Enterprise and plot a course for the center of the galaxy, where he hopes to unlock the greatest mystery of existence, to come face to face with God. Can Kirk, Spock, and McCoy overcome the threat this zealot represents, and what will they really find beyond the Great Barrier?
With Star Trek IV: The Voyage Home proving to be the franchise's biggest hit to date, Paramount was eager to move forward with a new film in the series. William Shatner, who had already secured the job of directing, became fascinated with televangelists and the cult-like following they inspired. He used this to create the story of Star Trek V, which would be about a religious fanatic taking over the Enterprise, alienating Kirk, and then going to the center of the universe in search of God, only to find Satan. After getting a green light from Paramount head Frank Mancuso, Shatner created a film treatment and took it to Harve Bennett. Bennett had grown tired of Star Trek by this point and was vocal in his desire to leave the franchise behind, but Shatner convinced him to stay for at least one more film. Bennett, however, was pretty critical of Shatner's story, warning that its theological subject matter and portrayal of a Judeo-Christian Satan would alienate audiences. The pair then reworked the story, changing Satan to an imprisoned alien pretending to be God, and adding more adventure elements to the plot. When Gene Roddenberry got hold of the story, he was unimpressed and borderline offended by it. Though he'd written a very similar treatment for the first Star Trek film, called The God Thing, he didn't think it was wise to include such weighty theological ideas in the Star Trek universe.
What does God need with a starship?
Moreover, he was very critical of the idea that the Enterprise crew, especially Spock and McCoy, would be converted to the villain's messiah complex at the expense of their loyalty and friendship to Captain Kirk. He wasn't alone in that either, as both Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley raised similar objections. The studio was also nervous about the subject matter, but it was even more concerned about the escalating budget, with the entire cast becoming far too expensive for the more economical approach Harve Bennett had taken with the previous films. Knowing that the script needed help, Bennett and Shatner approached Nicholas Meyer, but he was much too busy with The Deceivers and company business to wade back into Star Trek. After Meyer turned them down, Bennett suggested David Lowery, writer of 1984's Dreamscape, who had several ideas for how to solve the script's thornier problems. Unfortunately, in the middle of working on Star Trek V, he had to step away as a result of the 1988 writer's strike, which went on for 5 months and remains the longest strike in WGA history. This ground things to a halt, and to make matters worse, Leonard Nimoy, who'd been dealt a series of personal tragedies including the recent passing of both of his parents, stepped away to work on The Good Mother, which proved to be a box office flop. Around the same time, he also directed the fantastic Voyage-inspired theme park ride Body Wars at Walt Disney World's Epcot, but I can't tell if that happened before or after Star Trek V. I just have to include it, though, because I think it's a fun bit of trivia. Despite these delays, Paramount wanted to move forward as quickly as possible.
Let's go to work.
Worried that the momentum from Star Trek IV wouldn't last much longer. They fast-tracked the production as soon as the writer's strike came to an end, and a lot of script changes were made by Lowery behind Shatner's back. Shatner made Lowery remove some of these changes, but with pre-production already well underway and Paramount demanding significant cuts to keep the budget manageable, there wasn't a lot of time to clean up the script. Among the most significant changes were the inclusion of a controversial familial connection between Spock and the villain Sybok, which made the conflict between Spock and Kirk more believable, and the decision to not have Spock and McCoy betray their captain. Whereas Shatner had originally intended for Sybok to win the crew over to his cause by virtue of his own charisma and force of will, this never quite worked, and so his powers of persuasion were turned into a largely unexplained bit of psychic brainwashing. A lot of the regular Star Trek cast members were uneasy about the script, but they signed on anyway, no doubt influenced by significant pay raises all around. The only actor who needed extra convincing was George Takei, who didn't like the idea of working under Shatner's direction. The biggest challenge, though, was finding somebody to play the role of Sybok. In the early stages of development, the character had been written for Sean Connery, who was too busy with Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. The mythical planet of Shakari was given its name as a little nod to the actor.
Fascinating.
After briefly considering Max von Sydow as a replacement, Shatner then found the lesser-known Lawrence Luckinbill, an actor, playwright, and director who'd done a number of one-man shows, including one in which he played former President Lyndon Johnson. It was for this latter performance that Shatner contacted him to play Sybok, and Luckinbill enthusiastically agreed to do it. If you ask me, Luckinbill is perhaps the single best thing about Star Trek V, and he infuses Sybok with the charm and gravitas the character needs, knowing when to chew the scenery beside Shatner and when to tone it down for emotional effect.
I want your respect. Are you afraid to hear me out?
Several other actors were brought in to play much smaller roles, including David Warner, who'd previously appeared in sci-fi classics like Tron, Time Bandits, and Time After Time, George Murdoch as the face and voice of the quote-unquote god, stuntman Todd Bryan as the Klingon captain, fitness enthusiast Spice Williams Crosby as his lieutenant, Charles Cooper as Commander Cord, William Shatner's daughter Melanie as this poor yeoman, and Harve Bennett himself as a Starfleet commander known only as Fleet Admiral Bob. A lot of filming was done at Yosemite National Park, where Kirk's free climb of El Capitan was faked with a clever fiberglass wall and the use of several stunt performers, at the Trona Pinnacles and other areas of the Mojave Desert, which proved a logistical nightmare for transportation and dust management, and of course in and around the Paramount lot, where the Enterprise bridge once again had to be rebuilt from scratch. Some of the corridor sets and the sickbay set were borrowed from Star Trek The Next Generation, which was filming at the same time. In total, principal photography was done in just under 3 months, from October to December of 1988. Though a rough cut was screened for the Paramount studio heads to high praise, It didn't include the visual effects. Industrial Light and Magic, which had worked on the 3 previous Star Trek films, was unavailable due to commitments on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and Ghostbusters 2. Finding another visual effects house in a short period of time with a restricted budget proved incredibly difficult, and so all involved settled on Bran Farren, who'd done work on Altered States and The Untouchables. The big problem with Farren, however, was that his company, Associates and Farren, was based in New York and New Jersey, whereas the film was being made on the other side of the country. With Shatner demanding pre-approval of every effects shot, the back and forth between East and West coasts was time-consuming and laborious, not to mention expensive. Farren was forced to cut corners in order to meet Paramount's budgetary demands in the absurdly short 3-month time window, and even then, several shots and sequences were nixed by Paramount before Farren could even make proper pre-test versions. As a result, some effect shots were recycled from previous films. Perhaps the most significant effects cuts, though, were to the climax of the film. Shatner had originally envisioned a battle between Kirk and a horde of demons conjured from the depths of hell by the false god. In the final script, these demons had turned into so-called rockmen, and Shatner had commissioned several suits to be made. Paramount's budget eventually limited the number of suits to just one, and when Shatner finally saw test footage of the Rockman in action, he was deeply unhappy with it, and ultimately had to remove the entire sequence, replacing it in post-production with a lot of editing sleight of hand. For the music, Jerry Goldsmith returned for the first time since Star Trek the Motion Picture. This time he incorporated Alexander Courage's original Star Trek theme with the one he created for that earlier film, which was also being used on television screens as the theme for Star Trek The Next Generation. Goldsmith's work is a highlight of the film, and though it doesn't stand out as much as some of the other Star Trek film soundtracks, and though I wouldn't call it his best work in the franchise, Goldsmith was wise to not punctuate the humor or overdo the dramatics. Even with all its edits, Shatner's first cut ran just over 2 hours, which was too long to ensure Paramount's targeted number of screenings. Test audiences were pretty negative on the film as well, and so Paramount made Bennett remove several scenes to cut the film down to under 105 minutes. Shatner, Bennett, and the studio then bargained to get a few more minutes put back in, but Shatner was never happy with the cuts, believing that they took away essential parts of his finished film. Not too long ago, Shatner lobbied Paramount to let him produce a director's cut, akin to the special edition of Star Trek the Motion Picture, but Paramount refused.
Understood. Kirk out.
Star Trek V: The Final Frontier released in June of 1989, in the middle of a record-breaking summer of blockbuster films. It received pretty poor reviews, with critics calling it a massive step down from the previous entry. Despite this, it was expected to earn as much as $200 million, and managed to have an opening weekend of $17.4 million, making it the best opening weekend of any Star Trek film to that point. Alas, poor word of mouth and a crowded summer release schedule led to a very quick drop-off, and the film only ran wide for 10 weeks, and only earned a total domestic box office of just under $50 million. Suffice it to say, it was a massive disappointment for Paramount and nearly killed the film franchise. It won 3 Razzie Awards for Worst Actor, Worst Director, and Worst Picture, and Harve Bennett was given the initial go-ahead to work on the prequel film that had been floating around for a few years involving a younger cast at Starfleet Academy. Fans don't tend to look back on Star Trek V too fondly. Roddenberry himself disavowed it, and it frequently finds itself at or near the bottom of every Star Trek ranking list on the internet. Even Shatner eventually admitted its flaws. In all honesty, it is a bit of a mess, with its production difficulties readily apparent on screen. The characters aren't treated particularly well by the brainwashing elements of the plot or by the story's refusal to acknowledge their readily apparent age, and the humor feels forced and cringeworthy in several places. The choreography is lazy, and the editing is distractingly choppy, especially during the hacked-apart climax. The sets and effects look painfully cheap, and several actors are wasted in minimal roles that serve little purpose. The Klingon subplot also goes nowhere despite an excellent setup in the previous film, and there is plenty of fodder for Trekkie nitpickers who want to find reasons to complain about how it treats the overall continuity. It would be very easy to lay blame for all the film's problems at the feet of its director. Indeed, many Trekkies have done just that, accusing Shatner of letting his own excesses take the helm.
However, after researching the movie and reading Shatner's own account of the production, which can be found in Elizabeth Shatner's book, Captain's Log, William Shatner's personal account of the making of Star Trek V, I don't think that's completely fair. According to fellow cast members, including one or two who aren't usually disposed to defend him, Shatner was an excellent director who did a good job juggling the behind-the-scenes madness without letting it affect the shoot itself. Sure, some of the film's biggest problems can be traced back to Shatner's original story treatment, but in the end, I think the majority of the blame for Star Trek V's failure lies with Paramount, which had been pushing the franchise into ever more ludicrous constraints following the excesses of Star Trek the Motion Picture. All of the subsequent original series films were rushed, but none so badly as Star Trek V, and I believe a little more time and money for script development and effects work could have gone a long way to making this a worthy entry in the franchise. That's because Star Trek V: The Final Frontier has a good premise that could have been executed well. Shatner's story needed more work to hammer out some of the plot contrivances and to tighten things up, but the idea of a Vulcan heretic leading a crusade that involves the hijacking of the Enterprise in order to search for God is compelling. Of all the films in the entire series, including the ones with different casts and crews, this one, I have to admit, feels more like the original television series than any other. While part of that is because of its episodic nature, along with its obvious budget and production shortfalls, part of it is also the story, which deals with many issues that Roddenberry himself wasn't afraid to tackle, and ends with a reveal totally in keeping with the show's mission statement. Brainwashing aside, I like how it handles the core trilogy of characters, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, and the movie is at its strongest when it elaborates on their relationship in novel ways. Shatner's idea of trying to tear them apart in order to test their bond could have been the touchstone to an excellent character study, and even though I hate sitting through their two renditions of Row, Row, Row Your Boat, I have to admit the bookends of them camping at Yosemite are endearing. And even though it's cliché and sentimental, I do appreciate that, in the end, they realize they are a family as strong as any other.
Please, Captain. Not in front of the Klingons.
And that God, as Kirk puts it, resides in the human heart.
I don't want my pain taken away. I need my pain.
The Klingon Empire is facing extinction and has reached out to the Federation with an olive branch for peace. When Captain Kirk and crew are sent on a diplomatic mission to retrieve the Klingon Chancellor of the High Council, however, unknown forces align to assassinate the idealistic Chancellor, dashing the hopes for an end to a bloody, generational conflict. Kirk and McCoy are arrested and convicted for the murder, while Spock and the remaining crew of the Enterprise must race against the clock to not only save their friends, but also figure out who is truly responsible and what they can do to marshal the Chancellor's dream into reality.
In the summer after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Leonard Nimoy went to Nicholas Meyer with an idea for a new Star Trek film. Despite the box office disappointment of Star Trek V, Paramount Pictures wanted to make one last film with the original cast, to be released alongside the 25th anniversary of the franchise. For over a year, Harve Bennett had done pre-production work on his much-discussed prequel film, but the plug was pulled, leading to Harve Bennett walking away from Star Trek. In the wake of this, Nimoy, who took a leading role as executive producer, envisioned a political film that carried through the recurring motif of Klingons as stand-ins for the Soviets, and he wondered if there could be a story behind, quote, the fall of the Berlin Wall in outer space, unquote. That was the idea he pitched to Meyer, who was quite receptive and eager to hire his occasional screenwriting assistant, Denny Martin Flynn. Due to messy studio politics, Paramount instead hired the writing duo of Lawrence Connor and Mark Rosenthal, who never produced anything anybody was happy with. Eventually, the studio, after dealing with its own myriad headaches, reluctantly agreed to let Meyer and Flynn write a new screenplay, which Meyer would eventually insist be titled The Undiscovered Country, his original title for Star Trek II. Meyer and Flynn, with finished script in hand, faced two immediate hurdles. The first was Gene Roddenberry, who, even though he had no actual authority over the production, called a meeting with all involved in which he expressed his severe unhappiness with it. Roddenberry was vehemently opposed to the idea of inserting any kind of prejudice into the Federation characters.
Guess who's coming to dinner?
And he continued to disapprove of the more militant style that Meyer had pioneered with The Wrath of Khan. Meyer vented his frustrations with Roddenberry at this meeting, and would later deeply regret his behavior, especially considering the fact that Gene Roddenberry died a few months later. Ultimately, Roddenberry was unable to effect any changes to the script, and Star Trek VI went ahead without his blessing. However, with pre-production underway, the film came to a sudden halt when it hit its second hurdle, when Meyer was informed that the $40 million budget he'd asked for had been turned down. The new bottom line was $27.5 million, the exact budget of Star Trek V. Meyer and Flynn did what they could to trim the script, and many of the cast and crew agreed to deferments on their wages, but it still wasn't enough. After making an impassioned plea to Paramount that it would be impossible to make the film under such a constraint, mostly because he would need to completely rebuild the Enterprise bridge, which had been damaged, Nicholas Meyer was told that the project was cancelled. Fortunately, the same studio politics that had been wreaking havoc behind the scenes actually turned in Star Trek's favor for a change. The interim studio head Stanley R. Jaffe overruled the previous decision, and indeed would ultimately fire the man responsible for it, and agreed to $30 million, which was still lower than Meyer had hoped for, but was in line with what he'd been told to expect when he was first approached. Thus, Star Trek VI was given an official green light. Meyer did have to make some compromises to achieve the revised budget, such as cutting an extensive roundup sequence in which the crew of the Enterprise is brought out of retirement one at a time, but the director had enough to make the film, reminding himself that art thrives under restrictions. All of the regular cast agreed to return, but one sticking point was the character of Saavik, who played a significant role in the script. Meyer wanted Kirstie Alley to reprise the role from Star Trek II, but Alley turned it down for reasons that we can only speculate on, but which probably have a lot to do with her role in Cheers at the time. He instead turned to Kim Cattrall, the same actress he'd originally wanted for the part in The Wrath of Khan. Cattrall only agreed once the character was changed, once Saavik was replaced with a new but very similar character named Valeris. Perhaps unfairly, Robin Curtis, who had played Saavik in Star Trek 3 and 4, was never approached. The primary villain, Chang, had been written with Christopher Plummer in mind. Plummer initially turned down the part, but with some coaxing from Nimoy and Meyer, and no doubt some contract negotiations, he eventually came around to the idea. In subsequent years, the actor has said that Star Trek VI was one of his favorite filmmaking experiences, and that Chang was a delightfully fun villain to play.
Cry havoc! And let's slip the dogs of war!
For the critical role of Chancellor Gorkon, whose name is a none too subtle nod to Mikhail Gorbachev, they approached Jack Palance. When he turned them down, Meyer asked David Warner, who'd not only appeared as a human in Star Trek V, but had also played Jack the Ripper in Meyer's first feature film, Time After Time. Warner modeled his performance on Abraham Lincoln, who also served as a visual and thematic template for his character. Other notable actors include Brock Peters reprising his role as Admiral Cartwright, Iman as the shape-shifting Martia.
Not everybody keeps their genitals in the same place, Captain.
Anything you want to tell me?
Michael Dorn playing Worf's grandfather, Renee Auberjonois as Colonel West, whose scenes were cut from the theatrical release but then put back in for home video, Grace Lee Whitney and Mark Leonard as Janice Rand and Sarek, respectively, Kurtwood Smith as the Federation president.
This president is not above the law.
William Morgan Shepard as the Klingon prison warden, Walter Koenig's wife Judy Leavitt as this Starfleet military aide, and Christian Slater, who was a Trekkie that managed to get a cameo because his mother was the casting director. Filming took place over 5 months in mid-1991, which mostly fell in between seasons 4 and 5 of Star Trek The Next Generation, and utilized redressed versions of many of the television show's sets. There was some location shooting done in Alaska, and at Bronson Canyon and Griffith Park, and some sets were built from scratch, including the bridge set, which was used for both the Enterprise and the Excelsior, and the spectacular Klingon courtroom. ILM was brought back to do the visual and special effects, but the budget only allowed for the use of existing models that had to be repaired and repainted. Over half of the planned effects shots had to be cut out at the script stage, but ILM managed to make up for the loss by including some truly memorable sequences, including the zero-gravity assassination and the climactic fight between the Enterprise and General Chang's cloaked bird of prey. For the music, Meyer tried to get James Horner or Jerry Goldsmith to return, but both turned him down. Instead, the film was scored by Cliff Idleman, a young and lesser-known composer for whom this was a big break. While Idleman's score is not my favorite of the Star Trek film scores, it is memorable for being moody and mysterious, riffing on Holst's The Planets and Wagner's The Valkyrie. Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country released in December of 1991 to a warmer critical response than its predecessor and a domestic box office return of $75 million, a big success for the troubled Paramount Studios in a year that was generally disappointing throughout the industry. It has remained a favorite among Trekkies and is widely considered a good send-off for the original cast members, even though it really wasn't an end for most of them. In my list of favorite original Star Trek films, The Undiscovered Country is a very close second behind Star Trek II, as it does justice to the characters and universe in a way that only seems to have been possible because of Nicholas Meyer. He gives a remarkable amount of humanity to these familiar players and pushes the envelope further than Roddenberry was ever comfortable with. For example, he wasn't afraid to insert a lot of casual racism into Starfleet.
Klingons would become the alien trash of the galaxy.
The Klingons have never been trustworthy. They're animals, Jim.
They're dying.
Let them die.
They all look alike.
What about that smell? You know only top-of-the-line models can even talk. And
did you see the way they ate?
Horrible pebble mothers.
They don't place the same value on life as we do, Spock. You know that.
While Roddenberry, and even some of the cast members, were deeply uncomfortable with this aspect of the plot, it leans heavily on the themes Meyer is trying to express, and it is fitting for a real world in which the Cold War had just come to an unexpected end. Of course, Kirk would have a blind spot for the Klingons, following the death of his son, and of course, Spock would let logic cloud his personal judgment. It also leans into the age of the characters in a way that the previous film had tried to avoid, and it demonstrates how the stubborn bigotry of old age can often infect the younger generation in ways we don't intend.
Did you not wish Gorkon dead? Let them die, you said. Did I misinterpret you?
It also isn't afraid to be a blatant product of its time, replete with historical references like Nixon going to China and Adlai Stevenson being unwilling to wait for a translation during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Heck, even the inciting incident that literally starts the movie with a bang is an obvious take on how the Chernobyl disaster marked the beginning of the end for the Soviet Union. Meyer also leans heavily on his knowledge of Shakespeare, including a brilliantly ironic use of the title,
The Undiscovered Country. The future.
Which comes from Hamlet's famous to be or not to be soliloquy. In Hamlet, the undiscovered country doesn't actually refer to the future, but to death. And the fact that the man who makes a toast to it in this film dies shortly thereafter can't be a coincidence. Gorkon's death sparks a Sherlock Holmes-style whodunit, which is fitting considering Meyer's long history with Holmes, and Spock gets a subtle nod referencing a heritage to the famous detective that had long been speculated about in the fandom.
An ancestor of mine maintained that if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
While some critics have complained over the years that the film is trying to be too many things at once, I think it succeeds in all aspects, in being simultaneously a political thriller, a jokey sci-fi action flick.
You know anything about a radiation surge?
Sir?
Chekhov?
Only the size of my head.
A prison escape movie, a complex mystery, and an exciting adventure in keeping with Star Trek tradition. But at its heart, I think where Star Trek VI shines brightest is in its recognition of how broad socio-political changes bring about fear and resentment, which is a massive obstacle on the path to Gene Roddenberry's utopic vision of the future. History is replete with examples of those who looked for peace and found an assassin's bullet for their trouble. And even though Chancellor Gorkon's fate is no different, at least his death is a catalyst for Kirk and company to correct their failings and fight for the ideals that Star Trek has always represented. That's why Star Trek VI: The Undiscovered Country is not only a satisfying capstone for the original franchise, but also a sci-fi classic.
Oh!